Okay, welcome back, my friends. Today is the day you've all been waiting for. It's poetry. My personal favorite unit of 10-1 English. We'll see how it goes online. It's a lot of fun in class. We'll try to do our best with this setup. So, the way this is going to go, rather than there being a little give and take, obviously, because you guys are not present, I'm just going to walk through the poems with you, very similar to how we did the short story unit, in which I'm going to write my annotations here on the screen for you. Those are your notes, alright? So I would highly suggest following along as I'm reading the poem to you, as I'm making my notes. Those are the things you could potentially be quizzed on. So there will be a quiz at the end of this unit. Not a difficult quiz, very similar to what the short story quiz was like. Essentially, if you are following along with all of the poems and you understand the big questions, so the main part of those poems and what I highlight as key elements of the work, then you'll be totally fine. So essentially, anything that I write down on this document, you could potentially be quizzed on. The only other thing that's going to be on your quiz is the figurative language vocabulary that I've given you as well. Okay, so that's it. We can go straight into it, and we're starting with Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. I'm going to tell you right now, you need to know the name of the poems and you need to know the author. This one, please don't lose a mark in your quiz for this one. The title of the poem is the first line. Because I Could Not Stop for Death. It's there for you. So all you need to remember is Emily Dickinson, which hopefully all of the fun facts about her life will help you remember her name. So she's a recluse, wouldn't leave her bedroom. If you wanted to talk to her, you had to talk to her through her bedroom door. She was prolific. She wrote over 1,800 poems in her lifetime, but only 10 were published while she was alive. She wrote really weird poetry for her day. So as you can see here in this poem, she uses dashes everywhere. She throws in capitals where there shouldn't be capitals. She takes away capitals when there should be capitals. Her punctuation is very strange. And so when people found her poems, they weren't sure if this was done on purpose, if it had meaning to it, or if she was just a little bit off her rocker, okay? So, depends on whose opinion you're going to listen to. Some people think it has significant meaning. Some people close read her grammar. Other people pay more attention to what the poem is actually saying. So let's start straight away into analyzing this poem. And the big question I want you to think about that I've already written at the top here is, how does this narrator feel about death and life? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the entirety of the poem once through, and then I would encourage you to just pause the video and consider this question for yourself. How does this narrator perceive death? And then how does she perceive life? All right. I do want to strain is not the right word. I want to highlight the fact that poetry is not something that you're supposed to understand the first time you read it. If you can read a poem and say, oh yeah, I got that, that made sense, the first time you read it, it's probably not a very good poem. Poetry has so many deeper levels and hidden meanings, and it's supposed to speak differently to every person who reads it, and it's not supposed to be fully understood the first time you read it. So if you're reading a poem and you think to yourself that makes absolutely no sense, it doesn't mean you don't get it. It just means you probably need to read it another 3 or 4 times before it clicks. And even then, the next time you come back and read it, you know, a week later, a month later, years later, you can come back to the same poem and derive a completely different meaning from it. That is the beauty of poetry, okay? So a lot of people get frustrated and say, oh, I just don't get poetry, it's so stupid, there's so much grammar, how am I supposed to elicit meaning from, you know, this abstract piece of work? That's the whole point, okay? It's supposed to take a little bit more work to derive meaning from a poem than it is to derive meaning from a novel. Okay, that's my little poetry rant. Let's get to it. So, Let me read the poem in its entirety first, then we'll go stanza by stanza and I'll highlight the key points. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove, at recess, in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. So we're going to consider the first two stanzas together. A stanza would just be the group of lines that form the basic unit of your poem. Okay, so this would be one stanza, this would be our second stanza. So I want you to consider, how is death being portrayed? So when we do a close reading of poems, we want to focus specifically on descriptive language. There's also something interesting about the way she writes death as well. So because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. So the words I'm highlighting here work to create a specific image of death, describing him as being kindly, civil. He knew no haste. Haste means like hurry up. Haste means to go fast, to be in a hurry. He knew not to be in a hurry. He knew no haste, which means that he was very relaxed. In a way, she's almost characterizing death as a sort of a gentleman. Okay, so the use of language, the use of diction, there we go, such as, say, kindly, and civility. Work to portray death as a sort of gentleman. And that's not the only thing that's a little bit weird about the way in which she's talking about death. Hopefully by now you've noticed that death, throughout the entirety of the poem, is capitalized. Alright? Why do we capitalize things? We only capitalize words that are names. Alright? So in this way, by capitalizing, the word death, the narrator personifies death as, we'll say, as a gentleman. So already we get the sense in these first two stanzas that death is not something to be fearful of. Oftentimes when we personify death, we personify him as really scary, evil images, so like the Grim Reaper, or other demonic things that we would usually think to associate with death. But here, Emily Dickinson is associating him with a kind gentleman who's waiting for her in a carriage, and he's in no rush. He's civil, he's being kind, and he's allowing her to put away her labor and her leisure. Right? So what's important here is that she's personifying death as a gentleman. he is not a figure to inspire fear. We'll just leave it at that for now, okay? And then I would like you to consider who's all in this carriage. There's the narrator, there's Death, but there's someone else as well. Okay, we slowly drove, he knew no haste. Oh, sorry. Because I could not stop for Death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. It's interesting that she chose to use the word immortality here, because normally when we think of death, oh my goodness, what's going on? When we think of death, we normally associate it with the word mortal. Mortal meaning that you can die. Immortal meaning that you never die. So the fact that Emily Dickinson chooses to use the word immortality to be something or someone linked with death is significant. So when we think of death, oh gosh, I'm so bad at this. There we go. When we think of death, we would normally think of mortality. We get a sense then that the narrator doesn't think of death being the end, but rather a step on towards eternal life, towards living an immortal life. Okay, so I wanted to highlight that point as well. The last thing that is interesting is this line here. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. Labor, we need to know what these words mean. Labor means strife, labor means work, labor means worries, right? Worries, strife, work. Leisure means the exact opposite. Leisure are all the things that we enjoy in life. And this narrator has put away her labors and her leisures too in replacement for Death's civility. Okay? So I'm going to add my notes here. So she's given up her worries, she's happily given up her worries and her joys of life in exchange for Death's graciousness. It would seem then that the text is suggesting as though the narrator is a little bit enamored with Death. Enamored meaning a little bit twitter-pated with the idea of him. That she sees him as such a gentleman who's coming to give her something better in replacement for a life of strife that she was living. She does say here that she had a bit of leisure, but as we keep reading on, we're going to see whether or not this narrator actually enjoys living. Okay. One last close reading thing that I find is interesting that you don't need to, I'm not going to ask this in the quiz, But the repeated L sound here, my labor and my leisure too. So you remember when I talked about repeated S sounds usually being associated with a snake-like quality? Repeated L sounds, leisure, labor, okay, those are lulling sounds, lulling, kind of like a lullaby, and they're used usually to suggest that you're comfortable with something. So in this way, the repeated dreamlike L sound is used to suggest that the narrator is comfortable with the other occupants in the carriage. She's comfortable giving up her leisure, her labor and her leisure too. She's comfortable sitting in a carriage with death and immortality. Whereas most people don't see death as something that they would be very comfortable being around. We usually want to distance ourselves from death. We get the idea here that this narrator is pretty darn comfortable with him.